The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace as Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood at her bedroom window, watching the world slowly wake up beyond the palace gates. Her fingers traced the cool glass as she observed the early morning joggers and dog walkers going about their routines, blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing within the royal walls. William had been gone for 3 days now, attending what the palace had carefully termed urgent family business in Scotland. But Catherine knew better. She had seen the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched when he thought she wasn't looking, and, most tellingly, the stack of legal documents he had hastily shoved into his briefcase when she had entered his study unexpectedly. The truth was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Their marriage, once the fairy tale that had captivated millions around the world, was crumbling beneath the weight of expectations, duty, and the relentless scrutiny that came with their royal status. What had started as small disagreements about their children's education and their future roles within the monarchy had slowly evolved into something much more fundamental, a complete breakdown in communication and understanding. Catherine turned away from the window and walked to her dressing table, where a framed photograph of their wedding day sat prominently displayed. She picked it up with trembling hands, studying the faces of two young people who had believed their love could conquer anything. William's confident smile and her own radiant expression seemed to mock her from behind the glass. Had they ever really known each other, or had they simply been playing roles that the world expected them to fill? The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her room made her quickly replace the photograph and compose herself. A gentle knock on the door was followed by the familiar voice of Maria, her lady-in-waiting, who had become more friend than servant over the years. "Your Royal Highness, breakfast is ready in the morning room. The children are asking for you." Catherine closed her eyes and took a deep breath. George, Charlotte, and Louis, her precious children who had no idea that their world was about to change forever. How do you explain to a 10-year-old boy who will one day be king that his parents' marriage has become a casualty of the very institution he is destined to lead? "I'll be down in a moment, Maria," Catherine replied, her voice steadier than she felt. As she made her way through the familiar corridors of Kensington Palace, Catherine couldn't help but remember the early days of her marriage when these same halls had felt like a sanctuary. She and William had been so hopeful then, so determined to modernize the monarchy while honoring its traditions. They had grand plans to use their platform to make a real difference in the world, to show that duty and love could coexist beautifully. But somewhere along the way, the pressure had become too much. The constant media attention, the rigid protocols, the endless obligations, it had all taken its toll. William had grown increasingly distant, throwing himself into his royal duties with an almost desperate intensity. Catherine had tried to bridge the gap between them, but her attempts at conversation were met with polite but distant responses, as if she were just another person on his daily schedule rather than his wife. The breaking point had come 6 weeks ago during a heated argument about Louis's future schooling. What should have been a simple discussion between parents had escalated into a full-blown confrontation about their values, their priorities, and their vision for their family's future. Words had been said that couldn't be taken back. Wounds had been opened that seemed impossible to heal. In the morning room, her children greeted her with the enthusiastic energy that only young ones possess. George, now 10 and beginning to understand the weight of his future responsibilities, was practicing his penmanship at the table. Charlotte, 8 years old and fiercely independent, was engaged in an animated conversation with her governess about the upcoming school science fair. 7-year-old Louis was building an elaborate tower with his breakfast toast, completely absorbed in his architectural endeavors. "Mummy, when is Papa coming home?" Charlotte asked, looking up from her notebook with those piercing blue eyes that reminded Catherine so much of William. The question hit Catherine like a physical blow. She sat down next to her daughter and smoothed her hair, trying to find words that would be honest without being devastating. "Papa is still in Scotland, darling. He has some important work to finish there. But he's been gone forever," Louis chimed in, abandoning his toast tower. "I want to show him my new drawings." Catherine's heart broke a little more with each innocent comment. These children adored their father, and, despite everything that was happening between them, she knew William loved them desperately. That was perhaps the most tragic part of this entire situation. They were destroying something beautiful and irreplaceable not because they didn't care about each other, but because they cared too much about different things. After breakfast, Catherine walked through the palace gardens, seeking solace in the carefully cultivated beauty that surrounded her. The Rose Garden, which had been one of Princess Diana's favorite spots, seemed particularly poignant this morning. Catherine often came here when she needed to think, feeling somehow connected to the woman who had walked these same paths decades earlier, facing her own marital struggles under the unforgiving glare of public scrutiny. Her phone buzzed with a text message from William. "We need to talk. I'll be back this evening. The lawyers have prepared the documents." Catherine stared at the message for a long moment, the reality of their situation hitting her with renewed force. The lawyers, the documents, the end of everything they had built together. She thought about the early days of their relationship at university, when William had been just another student, and she had been the girl who caught his eye across a crowded room. There had been no cameras then, no protocols to follow, no ancient traditions to uphold. They had been free to discover each other at their own pace, to make mistakes, and laugh about them, to dream about a future that seemed limited only by their imagination. But love, Catherine had learned, was not always enough. Sometimes duty called louder than the heart, and sometimes the weight of history was too heavy for two people to carry together. As she sat on a bench beneath an ancient oak tree, Catherine allowed herself to remember some of the happier moments. Their secret weekend getaways to Balmoral in the early years of their marriage, where they could pretend to be a normal couple for just a few precious hours. The night George was born, when William had cried with joy and whispered promises to be the best father and husband in the world. The family holiday in Mustique 2 years ago, when they had built sandcastles with the children and watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. These memories felt like treasures now, precious gems that she would carry with her whatever the future might bring. But they also served as painful reminders of what was being lost, of the dreams that were being sacrificed on the altar of incompatibility and circumstance. Her private secretary, James, found her in the garden an hour later, his expression carefully neutral as he approached. "Your Royal Highness, I'm sorry to disturb you, but we've received several requests from the media regarding the Prince of Wales's extended absence. How would you like me to respond?" Catherine looked up at him, this kind man who had served her faithfully for 5 years, and who undoubtedly suspected that something was seriously wrong. The palace machinery would need to be prepared for what was coming, but she wasn't ready to make it real by speaking the words aloud. "Please tell them that the prince is attending to family matters and will resume his public duties shortly." No further comment. James nodded and retreated, but Catherine could see the concern in his eyes. Soon, very soon, there would be no hiding the truth from anyone. The afternoon passed in a blur of normal activities that felt surreal given the circumstances. Catherine attended a video call with the team organizing her upcoming mental health initiative launch, reviewed plans for a children's hospital visit scheduled for the following week, and had tea with her mother, Carol, who had stopped by for what she claimed was a casual visit, but which Catherine suspected was actually a wellness check. "You look tired, darling," Carol observed, studying her daughter's face with the practiced eye of a mother who had watched her navigate the complexities of royal life for over a decade. "I am tired, Mom," Catherine admitted, setting down her teacup with shaking hands. Carol reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. They didn't need to discuss the specifics. Carol had seen enough over the years to understand that royal marriages faced unique pressures that could destroy even the strongest bonds. "Whatever happens, you'll get through this," Carol said softly. "You're stronger than you know, and you have people who love you unconditionally." As evening approached, Catherine found herself pacing the drawing room like a caged animal, waiting for William's return. She had changed clothes 3 times, unable to decide what was appropriate attire for the conversation that would effectively end her marriage. In the end, she settled on a simple navy dress, elegant but not formal, serious but not mourning. The sound of a car in the courtyard made her heart race. Through the window, she watched William emerge from the back seat of his official car, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable. He moved with the measured pace of a man who had made a difficult decision and was determined to see it through. When he entered the drawing room, they stood facing each other across an expanse of Persian carpet that might as well have been an ocean. William looked older than his 41 years, the weight of his responsibilities etched in the lines around his eyes and the set of his shoulders. "Catherine," he said simply, her name carrying years of history and heartbreak. "William," she replied, matching his formal tone despite the intimacy of their shared past. He moved to the sideboard and poured himself a whiskey, his hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "I suppose you know why I'm here." "The documents," she said, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. He nodded and reached into his briefcase, withdrawing a thick folder that contained the legal framework for the dissolution of their marriage. The lawyers have been very thorough. They've tried to anticipate every possible complication. Catherine sat down heavily in the armchair that had been her favorite spot for reading to the children, the irony not lost on her. And the children? Joint custody, of course. They'll spend time with both of us. The constitutional lawyers are working on the implications for George's future role, but they seem confident that everything can be managed properly. The clinical nature of the conversation was almost surreal. Here they were, discussing the end of their marriage as if it were a business transaction, when just a few years ago they couldn't bear to be apart for more than a few hours. When will we tell them? Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. William's composure cracked slightly at the mention of their children. Tomorrow morning, I think. Before the palace releases the statement. The statement. Of course, there would need to be an official announcement, carefully crafted by the palace communications team to minimize damage to the monarchy while acknowledging the personal nature of their decision. Catherine wondered how they would phrase it, what euphemisms they would use to dress up the simple truth that two people who had once loved each other deeply could no longer find a way to live together. They spent the next hour going through the practical arrangements with the dispassionate efficiency of lawyers rather than the emotional intensity of divorcing spouses. Custody schedules, public appearances, the division of charitable patronages. Every aspect of their lives was dissected and reorganized for their separate futures. As William prepared to leave for his temporary residence at St. James's Palace, he paused at the door and turned back to her. Catherine, I want you to know that this isn't about love. I will always love you, in my own way. This is about— I know, she interrupted gently. It's about everything else. He nodded, relief evident in his features that she understood. The children will be fine. We'll make sure of that. Yes, she agreed, though she wasn't sure she believed it. We will. After he left, Catherine sat alone in the drawing room as darkness fell around her. Tomorrow, she would have to find the words to explain to her children why their family was changing, why Mummy and Papa couldn't live together anymore, even though they both loved their children very much. Tomorrow, she would have to face the world as a divorced princess, a failed fairy tale, a woman who had been unable to make the most watched marriage in the world work. But, tonight, she allowed herself to grieve for the dreams that were dying, for the love that hadn't been enough, and for the little girl who had once believed that princesses always lived happily ever after. Outside, London continued its eternal rhythm, unaware that one of its most beloved royal couples had just taken the first formal step toward ending their marriage. But soon, very soon, the whole world would know that even fairy tales sometimes had heartbreaking endings. The morning arrived with an unusual stillness that seemed to hang over Kensington Palace like a heavy blanket. Catherine had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and rehearsing different ways to explain the unexplainable to her children. How do you tell three young souls that their world is about to fundamentally change, while somehow convincing them that they are still safe and loved? She rose before dawn and made her way to the kitchen, needing the comfort of familiar routines. The palace staff wouldn't be expecting her for another hour, which gave her precious time to prepare herself mentally for what lay ahead. As she made herself tea with hands that trembled only slightly, Catherine thought about her own childhood and how secure she had felt in her parents' unwavering partnership. Michael and Carol Middleton had their disagreements, certainly, but there had never been any doubt that they were a team, united in their love for their children and their commitment to their family. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, who had grown up with such stability, was now about to shatter that same security for her own children. But she and William had tried everything: counseling, separate holidays, even brief periods of living apart, and nothing had bridged the growing chasm between them. If anything, their efforts to save their marriage had only highlighted how fundamentally different they had become. William arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, his punctuality a testament to his military training and his determination to handle this situation with the same precision he applied to his royal duties. He looked as if he had slept as poorly as she had, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled despite his obvious efforts to maintain his composure. They met in William's study, a room that had always been his sanctuary within their shared home. The walls were lined with books on history and constitutional law, photographs from his military service, and artwork that had been carefully selected to reflect his interests and values. It felt appropriate somehow that this conversation should take place here, in the room that best represented the man William had become, duty-bound, serious, and increasingly distant from the carefree young man Catherine had fallen in love with at university. "Are you ready?" William asked, his voice gentle despite the formality of his words. Catherine nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They had agreed the night before that William would take the lead in explaining their decision to the children, while Catherine would provide the emotional support and reassurance that would inevitably be needed. They found George, Charlotte, and Louis in the breakfast room, chattering excitedly about their plans for the weekend. George was explaining to his younger siblings how he intended to build a fort in the garden, while Charlotte was organizing an elaborate tea party for her dolls. Louis, ever the entertainer, was regaling them with a story about a magical dragon that lived in the palace gardens and only came out at night. The innocence of their conversation made Catherine's heart ache. In a few minutes, their carefree childhood chatter would be replaced by confusion, questions, and the kind of adult concerns that no child should have to bear. "Children," William said, his voice carrying the authority that came so naturally to him. "Your mother and I need to talk to you about something important." The change in atmosphere was immediate. George, who at 10 was beginning to develop an awareness of the undercurrents in adult conversations, sat up straighter and fixed his father with a serious expression. Charlotte and Louis, sensing the shift in mood, stopped their chatter and looked expectantly at their parents. William took a deep breath and launched into the explanation they had carefully crafted together. He spoke about how sometimes grown-ups who love each other very much find that they can't live together anymore, not because they don't care about each other, but because they've discovered they want different things in life. He explained that this didn't mean they loved their children any less, and that both parents would always be there for them, just in a different way. Catherine watched her children's faces as William spoke, seeing the exact moment when understanding dawned in George's eyes, followed quickly by a flash of fear that he tried valiantly to hide. Charlotte's expression grew puzzled, as if she were working through a complex math problem, while Louis simply looked back and forth between his parents with the confused expression of a child who sensed something was wrong, but couldn't quite grasp what it was. When William finished speaking, the breakfast room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, Charlotte raised her hand as if she were in school. "Does this mean Papa won't live here anymore?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "That's right, darling," Catherine said, speaking for the first time since they had gathered. "Papa will have his own home, but you'll still see him all the time. You'll even stay with him sometimes for sleepovers. Like when we visit Granny at Sandringham?" Louis asked, his 7-year-old mind trying to make sense of this new arrangement. "Similar to that," William confirmed. "We'll have lots of adventures together, just like we always have." George had remained silent throughout this exchange, his young face displaying a maturity that Catherine found both heartbreaking and impressive. Finally, he looked directly at his father and asked the question that Catherine had been dreading. "Is it because of me? Because I'll be king someday, and it's too hard?" The raw vulnerability in her eldest son's voice nearly broke Catherine's resolve to remain strong. William immediately knelt beside George's chair and took his hands. "No, George. This has absolutely nothing to do with you or your future responsibilities. This is about your mother and me, and it's completely separate from how proud we are of all three of you. You are not responsible for adult problems, ever. Do you understand me?" George nodded solemnly, but Catherine could see that he wasn't entirely convinced. At 10 years old, he was already showing signs of the burden that would one day rest on his shoulders, the weight of a crown that seemed to complicate everything it touched. The next few hours were spent answering questions, offering reassurances, and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while their world reorganized itself around this new reality. The children reacted as children do, with a mixture of sadness, confusion, and surprising resilience. Charlotte wanted to know if she could decorate Papa's new house, while Louis was primarily concerned about whether his favorite stuffed elephant would be able to travel between homes. By noon, the immediate crisis had passed, and the children were playing in the garden under the watchful eye of their nanny, who had been quietly briefed on the situation. Catherine and William stood at the window, watching their offspring adapt with the remarkable flexibility that young people possess. "They're going to be fine," William said, though Catherine suspected he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Eventually, Catherine agreed. "But it's going to be hard for them, especially George." William's jaw tightened at the mention of their eldest son. "The constitutional lawyers believe this won't affect his position in the line of succession." The precedent with his great-great-uncle Edward shows that the monarchy can survive royal divorces. There it was again, the clinical approach that William had adopted to cope with the emotional magnitude of their situation. Everything viewed through the lens of constitutional precedent and royal protocol, as if they were historical figures rather than real people with beating hearts and complicated feelings. I wasn't talking about his position in the line of succession, William, Catherine said quietly. I was talking about a 10-year-old boy who's just learned that his parents' marriage is ending. For a moment, William's careful composure slipped, and Catherine caught a glimpse of the pain he was working so hard to hide. I know that, Catherine. I'm trying to deal with this the only way I know how. And that, Catherine realized, was perhaps the root of their problem. William dealt with emotional crisis the way he had been trained to deal with everything, through duty, protocol, and the subordination of personal feelings to larger institutional concerns. It was what made him an excellent future king, but it had made him an increasingly distant husband and father. The afternoon brought the arrival of the palace communications team, led by the press secretary who had managed royal crises for over a decade. They gathered in the formal sitting room to discuss the timing and content of the official announcement that would inform the world of the Wales's separation. We need to control the narrative from the beginning, the press secretary explained, spreading documents across the coffee table like battle plans. The statement should emphasize the amicable nature of the separation, the couple's continued commitment to their children and royal duties, and their request for privacy during this difficult time. Catherine listened to the discussion with a growing sense of unreality. Here were people debating the best way to package the end of her marriage for public consumption, discussing focus groups, and polling data as if her personal tragedy were a product launch rather than the collapse of everything she had believed in. What about the timing of the announcement? William asked, his pen poised over a draft statement. Monday morning, the press secretary replied without hesitation. It gives us the weekend to prepare responses to anticipated questions, and Monday news cycles are generally more manageable than Friday afternoon announcements, which can spiral out of control over the weekend. Monday morning, Catherine tried to imagine what it would feel like to wake up on Tuesday as a publicly separated woman, her private pain now the subject of international commentary and speculation. Every decision she made would be analyzed for signs of bitterness or weakness, every public appearance scrutinized for evidence of how she was coping with the end of her fairy tale marriage. As the meeting concluded and the communications team departed, Catherine found herself alone with William for the second time in 24 hours. The contrast with their conversation the previous evening was stark. Then, they had been two people making a difficult personal decision, while this afternoon they had been royal figures managing a constitutional and public relations crisis. Are you going to be all right? William asked, and for a moment he sounded like the young man who had once worried about her adjusting to life in the royal goldfish bowl. I honestly don't know, Catherine replied. I've never been divorced before, let alone divorced in front of the entire world. William moved closer to her, and for a confused moment Catherine thought he might embrace her the way he had during their happier times. Instead, he simply placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You're stronger than you think you are. You've handled everything royal life has thrown at you with more grace than anyone had a right to expect. You'll handle this too. It was the kindest thing he had said to her in months, and it made Catherine's eyes fill with tears she had been determined not to shed in front of him. What about us, William? After everything is finalized, and the lawyers have divided up our lives into neat little packages, what happens to us? William was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the garden where their children were playing. I suppose we learn how to be friends again. For their sake, if nothing else. Friends. The words sounded strange when applied to someone she had shared a bed with for over a decade, someone who had held her hand during childbirth and comforted her after the death of her grandmother. But perhaps friendship was the best they could hope for now, a civilized relationship that would allow them to co-parent effectively while living separate lives. That evening, Catherine had dinner alone with her children for what she realized might be the last time for quite a while. Tomorrow, William would begin the process of moving his personal belongings to St. James's Palace, and their family dinners would become scheduled events rather than daily occurrences. The children were quieter than usual, processing the day's revelations in their own ways. George asked careful questions about logistics. When would they see Papa? Where would they spend Christmas? Whether their security arrangements would change. Charlotte wanted reassurance that both parents would still attend her school events, while Louis seemed most concerned about whether the family dogs would be confused by the new arrangements. As Catherine tucked each child into bed, she found herself memorizing details. The way George's hair stuck up despite her attempts to smooth it down, Charlotte's insistence on arranging her stuffed animals in a precise formation before sleep, Louis's request for just one more bedtime story. These rituals would continue, but they would never be quite the same. Later that night, Catherine walked through the rooms of Kensington Palace, saying her own private goodbye to the life she had built there. The drawing room where she and William had entertained foreign dignitaries and close friends alike. The study where she had worked on her charitable initiatives and learned the intricate protocols of royal life. The kitchen where she had stolen moments of normalcy, making tea and school lunches like any other mother. Each room held memories that would be bittersweet now. Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered across the floor, birthday parties where royal protocol had been temporarily suspended in favor of cake, and laughter, quiet evenings when she and William had actually talked to each other instead of simply coordinating their schedules. As she prepared for bed, Catherine caught sight of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. This wasn't the radiant bride who had walked down the aisle of Westminster Abbey to marry her prince, nor was it the confident princess who had mastered the art of royal engagements and public speaking. This was simply a woman in her 40s, facing an uncertain future and trying to summon the strength to rebuild her life from scratch. Outside her window, London slept on, unaware that in just 3 days the world would wake up to the news that would dominate headlines for months to come. But inside Kensington Palace, Catherine lay awake planning for a future she had never imagined, one where she would be a single mother, a divorced princess, and a woman who had loved deeply enough to let go when love was no longer enough to bridge the growing distance between two hearts that had once beat. As one Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that London rarely enjoyed, but Catherine barely noticed the golden light streaming through her bedroom windows. Today was the day that her private heartbreak would become public knowledge, transforming her from a beloved princess into a cautionary tale about the impossibility of maintaining a perfect marriage under the microscope of royal life. She had been awake since 4 o'clock, her mind racing through all the ways this announcement could unfold. The palace communications team had been thorough in their preparations, but Catherine understood better than most how quickly a carefully crafted narrative could spiral beyond anyone's control. She had watched other royal scandals unfold over the years, seen how the media machine could take a simple statement and dissect it until every word carried hidden meanings and sinister implications. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends and family members who had been quietly briefed about the impending announcement. Her sister Pippa had sent a series of heart emojis followed by a promise to come over later with wine and chocolate. Her brother James had texted a simple "love you" that somehow meant more than any lengthy message of support could have conveyed. Her parents had called twice already, offering to take the children for the day if she needed space to process what was coming. But it was the silence from William that spoke loudest of all. He was just across town at St. James's Palace, probably staring at his own phone and wrestling with his own demons. But they might as well have been on different continents. The easy communication that had once existed between them had been replaced by careful coordination through private secretaries and legal representatives. At 8:30, Catherine gathered her children for breakfast, determined to maintain their normal routine for as long as possible. George looked pale and serious, clearly understanding that today marked a significant turning point in their lives. Charlotte chattered nervously about her upcoming school project, while Louis seemed blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to break over their family. "Mummy," Charlotte said suddenly, setting down her spoon with a decisive clink. "Will the newspapers say mean things about you and Papa?" The directness of the question took Catherine by surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Charlotte had grown up surrounded by discussions of media coverage and public perception. She understood intuitively that royal life played out on a very public stage. "Some people might say unkind things," Catherine answered honestly. "But the important thing to remember is that what other people think doesn't change how much Papa and I love you, or how proud we are to be your parents." George looked up from his breakfast with the weighted expression that reminded Catherine so much of his grandfather's serious demeanor. "Will they blame you or Papa more?" The sophistication of his question revealed just how much their eldest son had absorbed about the dynamics of royal scandal over his short lifetime. Catherine felt a surge of protective anger that any 10-year-old should have to consider such things. But this was the reality of their lives. "I hope they won't blame anyone, darling. Sometimes grown-ups just can't live together anymore. and it's not anyone's fault. It's just sad. By 10 o'clock, the children had been whisked away to school by their security detail, who had been instructed to maintain an especially vigilant presence today. Catherine watched their convoy disappear down the palace drive and wondered what their day would be like. Would their classmates treat them differently once the news broke? Would their teachers know what to say? The palace statement was scheduled for release at 11 o'clock, giving the morning news programs just enough time to incorporate the announcement into their regular coverage. Catherine had declined to review the final version, trusting that the communications team would strike the right balance between honesty and dignity. She spent the remaining hour before the announcement walking through her garden, seeking comfort in the roses that had bloomed despite the changing season. The quiet beauty of this private space stood in sharp contrast to the media frenzy that would soon erupt beyond the palace gates. Here, surrounded by carefully tended flowers and the whispered memories of happier times, Catherine could almost pretend that her life wasn't about to change irrevocably. At exactly 11 o'clock, her private secretary appeared at the garden door with a solemn expression that told Catherine everything she needed to know. "It's done, Your Royal Highness. The statement has been released." Catherine nodded, surprised by how anticlimactic the moment felt. After months of private anguish and weeks of careful planning, the end of her marriage had been announced to the world with the simple click of a computer mouse. "How long before the response begins?" she asked. The first call started coming in 3 minutes after the release. "I'd estimate we'll have requests from every major news organization in the world within the hour." And so it began. Catherine retreated to her private sitting room and watched with fascination and horror as her personal life became the day's biggest story. The television news channels immediately shifted into crisis mode, with royal correspondents appearing on screen to provide instant analysis of a situation they knew nothing about beyond the carefully worded palace statement. The announcement comes as a shock to many royal watchers. One correspondent declared solemnly, standing outside Buckingham Palace with his perfectly coiffed hair and expensive suit. "The Prince and Princess of Wales have long been considered the modern face of the monarchy, and their separation will undoubtedly raise questions about the future of the institution itself." Catherine changed channels, hoping for more measured coverage, but found instead a parade of self-proclaimed experts offering theories about what had gone wrong. Some blamed the pressures of royal life. Others speculated about personal incompatibilities that had allegedly been obvious to anyone paying attention. A few suggested that this was simply the inevitable result of a marriage that had begun as a fairy tale and had never successfully transitioned into reality. The most painful coverage came from the entertainment news programs, which treated the announcement like a celebrity breakup rather than the end of a marriage between two people with 3 children and deep ties to one of the world's oldest institutions. These shows featured breathless reporters standing outside Kensington Palace, speculating wildly about custody arrangements and future romantic relationships. By noon, Catherine's phone had been turned off on the advice of her security team, who were concerned about the volume of calls and messages from journalists seeking exclusive interviews or insider information. The isolation this created was both a blessing and a curse. It protected her from the immediate media onslaught, but it also cut her off from the outside world at a time when she desperately craved normal human connection. The first personal response came from an unexpected source. Queen Camilla arrived at Kensington Palace just after lunch, having driven herself in her small Range Rover rather than using an official car that might attract additional media attention. "I hope you don't mind my dropping by unannounced," Camilla said as she was shown into Catherine's sitting room. "I thought you might appreciate some company from someone who understands what you're going through." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. Camilla's own path to royal acceptance had been difficult and painful, marked by years of negative press coverage and public hostility. If anyone could understand the unique challenges of being a divorced woman in the royal family, it was the woman who had endured decades of criticism before finally being accepted as queen consort. "Thank you," Catherine managed. "I wasn't sure how to handle today." Camilla settled into the armchair across from Catherine with the casual grace of someone who had learned to be comfortable in any situation. "The first day is always the worst. All that speculation and analysis from people who don't know anything about your actual life. It's rather like being dissected by strangers." They spent the next hour talking about practical matters, how to shield the children from the worst of the coverage, strategies for maintaining dignity while still engaging with necessary royal duties, and the importance of having a small circle of trusted friends who would provide honest support rather than empty flattery. The thing to remember, Camilla said as she prepared to leave, is that this too shall pass. The media will move on to the next crisis soon enough, and you'll be able to rebuild your life without quite so much scrutiny. You're stronger than you know, Catherine. After Camilla's departure, Catherine found herself thinking about the older woman's journey from royal mistress to beloved queen consort. It had taken decades, but Camilla had ultimately won public acceptance through consistent service and quiet dignity. Perhaps there was hope for Catherine's own future, whatever form it might take. The afternoon brought a parade of visitors, each offering their own form of support. Catherine's mother arrived with homemade soup and fierce maternal protectiveness, ready to defend her daughter against any criticism from any source. Her close friend from university days brought wine and gossip about mutual acquaintances, providing a precious hour of normalcy in an otherwise surreal day. Most meaningful of all was a handwritten note that arrived by special messenger from Princess and William's aunt. The Princess Royal was known for her no-nonsense approach to royal duty and her impatience with media drama, but her message to Catherine was surprisingly warm and personal. Dear Catherine, the note read in Anne's distinctive handwriting. Royal marriage is not for the faint of heart, and royal divorce is even more challenging. You have conducted yourself with exemplary grace during your time in this family, and I have no doubt you will continue to do so. The children are lucky to have you as their mother. With admiration and respect, Anne. The simple recognition of her efforts meant more to Catherine than any of the elaborate expressions of sympathy she had received from other quarters. Princess Anne was not known for empty compliments or social pleasantries. Her praise was earned and, therefore, precious. As evening approached, Catherine prepared herself for the children's return from school. Their security detail had reported that the day had gone smoothly, with the school administration handling the situation with admirable discretion. But Catherine knew that her children would have questions and concerns that hadn't been fully addressed by the morning's conversation. George was the first to bring up the media coverage, having overheard fragments of news reports throughout the day. Some of the older boys at school said there were reporters outside their houses this morning. He reported as Catherine helped him with his homework. Is that going to happen to us? Probably, Catherine answered honestly. But remember that our security team is there to protect our privacy and our safety. The reporters aren't allowed to come onto the palace grounds. Charlotte, meanwhile, was more concerned about practical matters. Will we still have our same bedrooms? And what about Lupo? She asked, referring to their beloved family dog. Yes, your bedrooms will stay exactly the same. And Lupo will live here with us. But Papa will visit him all the time. Louis, characteristically, was focused on the immediate future. Can we still go to Granny's for Christmas? And will Papa come too? These were the questions that the palace communications team hadn't prepared talking points for. The small, specific concerns of children whose lives had been irrevocably altered by their parents' incompatibility. Catherine found herself improvising answers, trying to provide reassurance while acknowledging that many aspects of their future remained uncertain. After the children were asleep, Catherine poured herself a glass of wine and settled into her favorite reading chair with a book she had been meaning to finish for months. But the words swam before her eyes, her concentration shattered by the magnitude of the day's events. Instead, she found herself thinking about William and wondering how he had spent his first day as a publicly separated man. Had he felt the same mixture of relief and terror that had characterized her own experience? Was he questioning their decision, or was he already planning for a future that didn't include her? The strangest part of the entire day had been the absence of any direct communication between them. They had shared a marriage, 3 children, and over a decade of their lives. But today they had become virtual strangers, connected only through lawyers and press secretaries. At 10 o'clock, Catherine's private secretary knocked softly on her sitting room door. I'm sorry to disturb you, Your Royal Highness, but His Royal Highness has asked if he might speak with you briefly. He's on the secure line. Catherine's heart raced as she took the phone, unsure what to expect from this first conversation since their separation had become public knowledge. Catherine, William's voice sounded tired but steady. I wanted to check on you and the children. Today must have been difficult. It was, she admitted. But we got through it. How are you holding up? I'm managing. The calls have been relentless, but the team has handled most of it well. I wanted you to know that I've spoken to the children's headmasters personally. They've assured me that extra security measures are in place, and that the staff has been briefed on maintaining the children's privacy. It was so typical of William to focus on the practical arrangements, the protective measures that could shield their family from the worst aspects of this situation. In many ways, it was what had made him such an effective royal and such a devoted father, even as it had made him an increasingly distant husband. "Thank you," Catherine said. "That means a great deal." They spoke for a few more minutes about logistics and scheduling, their conversation carefully neutral and businesslike. But, as they prepared to hang up, William's tone softened slightly. "Catherine, I hope you know that despite everything, I have tremendous respect for how you've handled all of this. The children are incredibly fortunate to have you." It wasn't a declaration of love or an expression of regret about their decision, but it was an acknowledgement of their shared history and mutual respect that gave Catherine hope for their future co-parenting relationship. As she finally prepared for bed, Catherine reflected on the strangeness of the day. Her marriage had ended not with dramatic confrontations or bitter recriminations, but with careful statements and polite conversations. Perhaps that was appropriate for people whose lives had been shaped by duty and protocol from the beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new questions, but tonight Catherine allowed herself to feel a small measure of pride. She had survived the first day of her new life with dignity intact and her children's welfare protected. It wasn't the fairy tale ending she had once imagined, but it was a beginning nonetheless. 3 months had passed since the announcement that shook the foundations of the modern monarchy, and Catherine was slowly learning to navigate her new reality as a separated princess. The initial media frenzy had begun to subside, replaced by a more manageable level of ongoing interest that she was learning to cope with through careful planning and selective engagement with the press. The autumn had been a season of adjustment for everyone in their fractured family. William had settled into his temporary residence at St. James's Palace, though the arrangement was understood by everyone to be a stepping stone toward a more permanent separation of their lives. The children had adapted with the resilience that Catherine both envied and worried about. Were they truly coping well, or simply becoming expert at hiding their confusion and sadness? This particular Tuesday morning found Catherine preparing for what the palace communications team had euphemistically termed a significant transition event. In plainer language, it was the day that William would come to Kensington Palace to collect the remainder of his personal belongings, effectively completing the physical separation that had begun with his departure 3 months earlier. Catherine had spent the weekend carefully packing items that held special significance for William. Photographs from their university days that she thought he might want to keep, books that had belonged to his mother, small mementos from their travels together that seemed too personal to simply abandon. The process had been emotionally exhausting, each object triggering memories of happier times when their future had seemed bright and uncomplicated. The children would be at school during William's visit, a deliberate decision made to spare them the pain of watching their father systematically remove traces of his presence from their home. But Catherine had noticed that George, in particular, had been unusually quiet over the weekend, as if he understood the significance of what was happening even without being explicitly told. "Mummy," Charlotte had asked the night before, "when Papa takes his things away, does that mean he's never coming back here?" The question had pierced Catherine's heart with its simple directness. "Papa will always come back to visit you," she had answered carefully. "But, yes, this will stop being his home." At 9 o'clock precisely, Catherine watched from her bedroom window as William's car pulled into the courtyard. He emerged with the same measured composure that had characterized all their interactions since their separation. But Catherine noticed the slight tension in his shoulders that betrayed the emotional weight of this particular task. They met in the entrance hall with the formal politeness that had replaced their former intimacy. William was accompanied by his valet and a member of his security team, turning what might have been a private moment between former spouses into a carefully orchestrated logistical operation. "Good morning, Catherine," William said, his tone friendly but distant. "I hope this won't take too long. I know you have commitments this afternoon." "Take all the time you need," Catherine replied, gesturing toward the stairs that led to what had been their shared living quarters. "I've had Maria prepare boxes for the items we thought you'd want to keep." As they made their way through the familiar rooms, Catherine was struck by how strange it felt to be giving William a guided tour of spaces that had once been as familiar to him as his own reflection. But 3 months of living apart had already begun to change his relationship with this place, transforming him from a resident into a visitor. In his former study, William moved with efficient precision, selecting books and papers while leaving behind items that had obviously lost their significance for him. Catherine watched him pass over a framed photograph of their family taken during last year's holiday in Scotland, and She wondered whether the omission was deliberate or simply an oversight born of emotional self-protection. "You can keep that one if you'd like," she offered quietly, nodding toward the abandoned photograph. William glanced at it briefly before shaking his head. "I have plenty of photos of the children. This one seems to belong here." It was a small rejection, but it stung nonetheless. Catherine realized that William was not just removing his possessions from the house. He was actively distancing himself from the memories they had created together, editing their shared history to focus only on his relationship with the children rather than acknowledging the years of marriage that had preceded their separation. The master bedroom proved to be the most difficult room for both of them. William's clothes still hung in the wardrobe they had once shared, and his presence lingered in small details: the book on his nightstand that remained half-finished, the cologne bottle that still carried his scent, the watch winder that had been a gift from Catherine for their 5th wedding anniversary. "I wasn't sure about your jewelry," Catherine said, indicating a small box on the dresser. "Some of it was gifts from your family, but some pieces we chose together. I thought you might want to make that decision yourself." William approached the jewelry box with obvious reluctance, sorting through items that represented different chapters of their relationship. He took the cufflinks that had belonged to his father and the signet ring that marked his royal status, but left behind the wedding band that Catherine had placed on his finger 16 years earlier. "Are you sure?" Catherine asked, looking at the abandoned ring. "I'm sure," William replied firmly. "That chapter of our lives is closed." The finality in his voice was devastating, but Catherine forced herself to nod with apparent understanding. She had hoped that this process might provide an opportunity for some kind of emotional resolution between them, perhaps even a moment of shared sadness for what they had lost. Instead, William seemed determined to treat this as a purely practical exercise, stripping away the emotional significance of their shared possessions with the same efficiency he brought to his royal duties. By noon, most of William's belongings had been packed and loaded into a series of unmarked vans that would transport his possessions to their new home at St. James's Palace. Catherine stood in the courtyard, watching the methodical removal of evidence that her marriage had ever existed, and felt a profound sense of emptiness settle over her. "There is one more thing," William said, approaching her as the last of the boxes were secured. "The lawyers have finalized the custody arrangements, and they'd like us to review the schedule together to make sure it works for everyone." They retreated to the library, where Catherine's private secretary had laid out the legal documents that would govern their children's lives for the foreseeable future. The language was precise and comprehensive, covering everything from holiday schedules to decision-making authority for medical and educational matters. "It seems very thorough," Catherine observed, scanning the pages of carefully crafted clauses and conditions. "The lawyers were determined to anticipate every possible scenario," William agreed. "I think it will provide stability for the children, which is what matters most." As they discussed the practical implications of the custody arrangement, Catherine found herself studying William's face, searching for some sign of the man she had fallen in love with 20 years earlier. But the person sitting across from her seemed like a stranger, polite, professional, and emotionally inaccessible in a way that went beyond the natural awkwardness of their situation. "William," she said suddenly, interrupting his explanation of the school holiday provisions. "Are you happy? I mean, are you relieved that we've done this?" The directness of her question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, his careful composure slipped, and Catherine caught a glimpse of something that might have been sadness or regret flickering in his eyes. "Happiness seems like the wrong word," he said finally. "But, yes, I think this was the right decision for both of us. We weren't making each other happy anymore, Catherine. We were just going through the motions." It was the most honest thing he had said to her in months, and Catherine felt both grateful for his candor and devastated by its implications. "I keep wondering if we tried hard enough," she admitted. "If there was something we could have done differently." William was quiet for a long moment, staring at the legal documents spread between them. "I think we tried as hard as we knew how to try. Sometimes that's just not enough." The conversation was interrupted by the return of the children from school, their voices carrying through the halls as they chattered about their day. The sound brought both parents back to the present moment and their shared commitment to protecting their children from the worst aspects of their separation. George appeared in the library doorway first, his school uniform slightly rumpled and his hair in desperate need of combing. At 11, he was beginning to show signs of the height he would eventually inherit from his father, but his face still carried traces of childhood softness. "Hello, Papa," he said with the careful politeness that had become characteristic of his interactions with William since the separation. "Hello, George," William replied, rising to embrace his son with obvious warmth. "How was school today?" As the other children joined them, Catherine watched the transformation in William's demeanor. With his children, the careful emotional distance disappeared, replaced by the engaged warmth that had always characterized his relationship with them. Whatever else had gone wrong in their marriage, William's love for their children remained unquestionable and uncomplicated. Charlotte immediately began an animated description of her science project, while Louis demanded that his father admire the painting he had created in art class. For 20 minutes, they were almost like a normal family again, gathered in the library while the children competed for their parents' attention. But the illusion was shattered when Charlotte suddenly noticed the absence of William's belongings from the shelves where they had always been displayed. "Papa, where are your books?" she asked, her voice small and confused. William knelt to her level, taking her hands in his with infinite gentleness. "I moved them to my new house, sweetheart. Remember how we talked about Papa living in a different place now? But why did you have to take everything?" Louis asked, his 7-year-old logic struggling with the concept of divorce. "Couldn't you just leave some things here for when you visit?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, highlighting the practical reality that William was not just moving out. He was severing his connection to this place that had been their family home. Catherine felt tears threaten as she watched her youngest son grapple with concepts no child should have to understand. "Because this is Mummy's house now," William explained patiently. "And I have my own house where you'll come to visit me. You'll have bedrooms there too, and toys and books that belong just to you." It was a reasonable explanation, but Catherine could see that it didn't entirely satisfy any of their children. The logic of adult separation was too complex for young minds to fully grasp, especially when it involved the destruction of everything they had previously understood about the stability of their world. William stayed for dinner, sharing a final meal in the dining room where they had celebrated countless birthdays and holidays. The conversation was pleasant but carefully neutral, focused on the children's activities and upcoming school events rather than the emotional significance of the occasion. As the evening drew to a close, Catherine found herself dreading the moment when William would leave for the last time as a resident of Kensington Palace. Once he walked out that door, their separation would be complete in every practical sense, leaving only the legal formalities to be concluded. The children lined up in the entrance hall to say goodbye, each handling the moment in their own way. George offered a firm handshake that was heartbreakingly adult, while Charlotte clung to her father with obvious reluctance to let him go. Louis seemed confused by the formality of the farewell, asking repeatedly when Papa would be back. "I'll see you this weekend," William promised them. "We'll have adventures at my new house, and you can help me decide where to hang the pictures." After the children had been led upstairs for their bedtime routines, Catherine and William stood alone in the entrance hall where they had greeted so many guests over the years. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of everything that remained unsaid. "I suppose this is it, then," Catherine said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I suppose it is," William agreed. "Catherine, I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything we shared. The children, obviously, but also the good years. There were good years." It wasn't a declaration of love or an expression of regret about their decision, but it was an acknowledgement of their shared history that felt like a gift. Catherine nodded, not trusting herself to speak without crying. William moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "Take care of yourself, Catherine. You deserve to be happy." And then he was gone, walking out into the London night, and leaving Catherine alone in the house that had once been their sanctuary. She stood in the entrance hall for a long time, listening to the silence that seemed to echo with the ghosts of conversations and laughter from happier times. Eventually, she made her way upstairs to check on the children, finding them all safely asleep, but clearly unsettled by the emotional weight of the day. Charlotte had arranged her stuffed animals in a protective circle around her bed, while Louis clutched his favorite teddy bear with unusual intensity. George's room was neat and organized, but Catherine noticed that he had placed a framed photograph of the family on his nightstand, a silent statement about his determination to preserve what was being lost. As she prepared for bed in the master bedroom that now felt cavernous without William's presence, Catherine reflected on the strange nature of their final goodbye. There had been no dramatic confrontations, no bitter recriminations, no passionate pleas for reconciliation. Instead, Their marriage had ended with legal documents and carefully packed boxes, as civilized and emotionally restrained as everything else in their royal lives. Perhaps that was appropriate for people who had learned to subordinate their personal feelings to the demands of duty and public expectation. But, as Catherine settled into bed alone, she couldn't help but wonder if they had been so successful at controlling their emotions that they had forgotten how to feel them authentically. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter in her life as a truly single mother, a divorced princess, and a woman who would have to discover who she was when stripped of her role as half of a royal power couple. But, tonight, she allowed herself to grieve not just for her marriage, but for the simpler, more authentic relationship they might have had if they had been born into different circumstances, where love might have been enough to bridge the growing distance between two hearts that had once promised to beat as 1.1 year later. Catherine stood in the same garden where she had once sought solace during the darkest days of her marriage's collapse. The roses were blooming again, their vibrant colors a testament to the cycles of renewal that seemed to govern all living things. But the woman tending to them now was fundamentally different from the one who had walked these paths 12 months earlier, lost and heartbroken and uncertain about her future. The past year had been a journey of rediscovery that Catherine could never have anticipated. The initial months following William's final departure from Kensington Palace had been challenging in ways that went far beyond the obvious difficulties of single parenthood and public scrutiny. Catherine had been forced to confront not just the end of her marriage, but the realization that she had spent so many years defining herself in relation to William and their shared role that she had almost forgotten who she was as an individual. The divorce proceedings had been finalized 6 months earlier with the same dignified discretion that had characterized their entire separation. The legal dissolution of their marriage had made headlines around the world, but the actual process had been surprisingly straightforward thanks to the thorough preparation of their respective legal teams. More importantly, the custody arrangement had proven to work well for everyone involved, providing the children with stability and both parents with meaningful time to maintain their relationships with George, Charlotte, and Louis. Catherine had gradually resumed her full schedule of royal duties, discovering that her patronages and charitable work provided not just purpose but genuine fulfillment. Without the need to coordinate her activities with William's schedule or consider the optics of their joint appearances, she had been free to pursue causes that genuinely passionate her. Her mental health advocacy had deepened and expanded. Her work with early childhood development had gained international recognition, and she had launched several new initiatives focused on supporting single parents and divorced families. The public response to her new independence had been overwhelmingly positive. Rather than viewing her as a failed princess, people seemed to admire her resilience and dedication to her royal duties despite the personal challenges she had faced. The media coverage, while still intense, had become more respectful and focused on her professional accomplishments rather than her personal life. But perhaps the most significant change had been in her relationship with her children. The initial fear that the divorce would damage them had proven largely unfounded. George, now 12 and increasingly aware of his future responsibilities, had shown remarkable maturity in adapting to his parents' new arrangement. Charlotte had channeled her natural organizing instincts into helping manage the logistics of their dual household life. And Louis, at 8, had simply accepted that having 2 homes meant twice as many bedrooms to decorate and twice as many gardens to explore. The co-parenting relationship with William had evolved into something that was professional but warm, focused entirely on their shared commitment to their children's well-being. They communicated regularly about school events, medical appointments, and the children's various activities, but their interactions were carefully limited to practical matters. There had been no dramatic reconciliation scenes, no bitter conflicts, and no romantic entanglements on either side. Just 2 mature adults working together to provide stability for their children while building separate lives. On this particular morning, Catherine was preparing for an event that would have been unthinkable a year earlier, a joint public appearance with William at their children's school sports day. It would be their first time appearing together since the divorce had been finalized, and the media attention was expected to be intense. But George had specifically requested that both parents attend his cricket match, and neither Catherine nor William had been willing to disappoint him. As Catherine selected her outfit for the event, she reflected on how different her approach to public appearances had become. During her marriage, every clothing choice had been scrutinized for hidden meanings about the state of her relationship with William. Now, She dressed simply for herself and the occasion, choosing a casual but elegant ensemble that would allow her to move freely while supporting her son's athletic endeavors. The drive to the school was peaceful, giving Catherine time to mentally prepare for what would undoubtedly be a highly photographed occasion. She had learned over the past year to view media attention as simply part of her professional reality rather than a personal intrusion. The key was to remain focused on the genuine purpose of any public appearance rather than getting distracted by the artificial drama that journalists sometimes tried to create. When she arrived at the school grounds, Catherine was pleased to see that the headmaster had worked with both security teams to minimize disruption to the other families attending the sports day. The photographers were confined to a designated area, and the children were able to participate in their events without being overwhelmed by the unusual level of attention. William arrived shortly after Catherine, and they greeted each other with the polite warmth that had characterized their interactions since the divorce. To observers, they probably appeared to be successfully co-parenting former spouses who had managed to maintain a functional relationship focused on their children's needs. "Good morning, Catherine," William said as they walked toward the cricket field where George's match was about to begin. "Thank you for agreeing to do this together. I know the attention will be intense." "George asked for both of us to be here," Catherine replied simply. "That's reason enough." They found seats in the parents' section, maintaining a careful distance that was close enough to present a united front, but far enough apart to avoid speculation about reconciliation. Catherine watched with pride as George took his position on the field, his concentration intense, and his technique showing the benefits of months of practice. The other parents were gracious, but clearly aware of the unusual circumstances of this particular sports day. Catherine had always appreciated the school community's efforts to treat her children as normally as possible, and today was no exception. While conversations were perhaps more subdued than usual, the focus remained appropriately on the children's performance rather than their famous parents' personal lives. During a break in the cricket match, Charlotte appeared at their side with her characteristic determination. "Mummy, Papa, I need both of you to come see my art display in the school gallery. Miss Williams says it's the best piece she's seen all year, and I want you to see it together." Catherine and William exchanged glances, recognizing their daughter's attempt to recreate moments of family unity that had become increasingly rare. But Charlotte's request was reasonable, and her pride in her artwork was genuine, so they followed her through the school building to the gallery where student work was displayed. Charlotte's painting was indeed exceptional, a vibrant landscape that showed remarkable technical skill for a 9-year-old artist. But what struck Catherine most profoundly was the subject matter. Their family home at Anmer Hall in Norfolk, depicted during a golden summer afternoon with all 5 family members visible in the garden. "When did you paint this, darling?" William asked, studying the details with obvious emotion. "Last month," Charlotte replied proudly. "I painted it from memory, from when we were all together there last summer." Miss Williams says memory paintings are very hard to do, but I remembered everything perfectly. Catherine felt tears threaten as she looked at her daughter's artistic recreation of their last family holiday before the separation announcement. The painting captured not just the physical details of their Norfolk home, but somehow also conveyed the warmth and happiness that had characterized that final week of their intact family life. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Catherine managed, placing her arm around Charlotte's shoulders. "You should be very proud of your work." As they made their way back to the cricket field, William walked beside Catherine with uncharacteristic hesitation, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the right words. "That painting," he began finally. "It reminded me of how good we were at the family parts, even when everything else was falling apart." Catherine nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Their failure as a married couple had never extended to their success as parents. Even during the worst periods of their relationship, they had been able to come together when their children needed them. "We were good parents together," she agreed. "We still are." The cricket match resumed, and Catherine found herself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of watching her children participate in school activities. This was the aspect of royal life that she had always enjoyed most, the moments when protocol could be temporarily set aside in favor of genuine family experiences. George's team won their match, and his celebration was enthusiastic but dignified, showing the influence of his royal upbringing even in moments of pure childhood joy. Both parents cheered appropriately, and Catherine was touched to see William's genuine pride in their son's athletic achievement. As the sports day concluded, families began to disperse, and Catherine prepared to say goodbye to William for another few weeks until their next scheduled interaction. The children would spend the upcoming weekend with him, but their paths were unlikely to cross again until the next school event or family milestone. Catherine, William said as they walked toward their respective cars, I want you to know that I think you've handled this past year with exceptional grace. The children are thriving, and I know that's largely due to your efforts. It was perhaps the most personal comment he had made to her since their separation, and Catherine felt a flutter of something that might have been old affection mixed with melancholy. They're thriving because they have two parents who love them, even if those parents can't live together anymore, she replied. We both deserve credit for that. William nodded, and for a moment they simply stood together, watching their children gather their belongings and chat with their school friends. The scene could have been from their married life, but the emotional distance between them made it clear that those days were definitively over. I should go, William said finally. I'll pick up the children on Friday afternoon as usual. They'll be ready, Catherine confirmed. And, William, thank you for today. It meant a lot to George to have both of us here. As she drove home to Kensington Palace, Catherine reflected on the strangeness of their new relationship dynamic. They were no longer husband and wife, but they would be connected forever through their children. The intense romantic love they had once shared had evolved into something more complex, not friendship exactly, but a deep mutual respect and shared commitment that transcended their personal incompatibilities. That evening, as Catherine helped the children with their homework and listened to their excited recounting of the day's events, she felt a sense of peace that had been elusive during the chaotic early months of their separation. They had created something new from the wreckage of their marriage, not the fairy tale ending that the world had hoped for, but something perhaps more valuable, a functional family structure that prioritized their children's needs while allowing both parents to pursue their individual paths to happiness. Charlotte appeared at her mother's study door just before bedtime, carrying the small framed photo of the family that she kept on her nightstand. Mummy, she said thoughtfully, I know you and Papa can't be married anymore, but you'll always be my parents together, won't you? Catherine drew her daughter into a warm embrace, feeling the profound truth of those simple words. Always, darling. No matter what else changes, Papa and I will always be your parents together. That's a promise that will never be broken. As Catherine tucked each of her children into bed that night, she realized that they had achieved something that had seemed impossible a year earlier. They had taken the devastating end of a marriage and transformed it into the foundation for a new kind of family, one built on respect, cooperation, and an unwavering commitment to their children's well-being. It wasn't the happy ending that anyone had anticipated when a young prince married his university sweetheart in front of millions of viewers around the world. But it was, perhaps, something even more valuable, a demonstration that love can take many forms, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go while still holding on to what matters most. Outside her bedroom window, London sparkled in the darkness, home to millions of people living their own complicated stories of love and loss, hope, and heartbreak. Catherine's story was far from over, but she was finally ready to discover what the next chapters might hold for a woman who had learned that royal titles and fairy tale weddings were far less important than resilience, grace, and the enduring love between a mother and her children. Their marriage had ended, but their family would continue in a new form, bound together not by vows or duty, but by the unbreakable bonds of shared love and mutual respect. And perhaps, Catherine thought as she drifted off to sleep, that was the most royal ending of all.